Have you ever felt an inexplicable chill when talking to someone? A quiet signal in your body that something beneath their smile was not quite right. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century, spent decades exploring the depths of the human mind, and he came to recognize these subtle sensations as warnings. Beneath the surface of ordinary social life, Jung discovered a set of psychological dangers far more destructive than any visible threat, patterns that appear harmless at first glance, yet quietly corrode our relationships, our perception of reality, and even our sense of self. Jung's research revealed that many of the most dangerous traits in human behavior are not expressed through open hostility or aggression. Instead, they emerge through subtle distortions of perception, moral certainty, and emotional blindness.
Don't let the way crush my weary bones. Don't let the hard times leave me cold as stone. Please, great sky, give me strength to bear this load. I'm a tired soul, clean to the sky down this road.
Ancient wisdom traditions had spoken about such dangers long before modern psychology existed, but Jung gave them a scientific framework, allowing us to see how the unconscious shapes our lives in ways we rarely understand. One of the most troubling phenomena Jung identified is what he called shadow projection. The shadow represents all the parts of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, the anger, envy, insecurity, and selfishness that we prefer to imagine belong only to others. When these aspects are repressed, they do not disappear. They gather energy in the depths of the unconscious, waiting for a chance to surface. Shadow projection occurs when a person attributes their own denied qualities to someone else. Imagine speaking with someone who accuses you of having intentions or motives you've never had. They are not truly responding to you, but to a distorted image their mind has created. They see their own inner darkness reflected back and mistake it for yours. Ancient traditions understood this mechanism long before Jung articulated it. Buddhism speaks of a darkened mirror that reflects one's impurities as if they belong to another. Christianity uses the metaphor of the beam in one's own eye. The person who projects their shadow is not necessarily lying. They are convinced of the truth of their perception. Their mind is filtering reality through a lens of self-deception so powerful that it turns their own flaws into the faults of others. Modern neuroscience supports this, showing how the brain filters reality to confirm what it already believes. When shadow projection becomes extreme, this filtering turns into full distortion. To the person projecting, their illusion feels like fact. You can often recognize this when there's a strange gap between what someone says about you and what you know to be true. They may accuse you of emotions you've never felt or motives you don't have, and they'll do it with absolute certainty. Jung described this as a sign of an internal war being waged outside the self. The person is battling parts of their own psyche they cannot face, and you have unknowingly become the battlefield. Closely related to this is what Jung called psychic inflation, a psychological state in which the ego identifies itself with something far larger than the individual. In this state, people no longer see themselves as fallible human beings, but as moral authorities, divine messengers, or bearers of absolute truth. Unlike ordinary arrogance, which is often easy to recognize, inflation disguises itself as virtue. The person feels morally pure, spiritually enlightened, or unshakably right. Jung observed that this condition is particularly dangerous because it radiates confidence and certainty, which can be deeply persuasive to others. Throughout history, inflated egos have drawn followers not through reason, but through their sheer conviction. Spiritual traditions have long warned about this. Zen monks call it Zen sickness. Sufi mystics describe it as the veil of light, a brightness so blinding it hides the truth. The hallmark of psychic inflation is the absence of doubt. Those who suffer from it never question their motives or beliefs. While the wisest thinkers in history have approached life with humility before the unknown, the inflated personality believes their own thoughts to be divine revelation. They cannot imagine being wrong because to them they are not merely expressing opinions, they are speaking on behalf of the truth itself. Jung noted that this state is not only dangerous to others, but to the person experiencing it. When the small human ego identifies with immense archetypal forces, it becomes stretched beyond what it can handle. The greater the inflation, the more catastrophic the collapse that follows. The psyche eventually seeks balance, and what has been denied or suppressed returns with immense force. Another warning sign Jung identified is the total identification with the social mask, or what he called the persona. The persona is the version of ourselves we present to the world, the polite, well-adjusted mask that allows us to function in society. It is necessary to some degree, but when someone becomes completely identified with this mask, they lose touch with their authentic self. They begin to act in ways that are socially perfect, but internally empty. You might notice this when someone seems to say all the right things, behave impeccably, and display flawless manners, yet you feel a strange unease in their presence. Their perfection feels rehearsed, their smile somehow mechanical. Jung believed that when the external image becomes too polished, it hides a vast inner emptiness.
Got a heavy heart. Got a heavy heart. Can't leave this town. Everything's great when you're feeling this way.
Neuroscientists later found that our brains have mirror neurons that detect incongruities between someone's words, expressions, and emotions. When these signals don't align, we feel it as discomfort or distrust. The problem with a rigid persona is that it suppresses the shadow. The more energy a person invests in maintaining an image of perfection, the more chaos builds up beneath the surface. Eventually, this repressed material erupts in destructive ways. Jung's collaborator Marie-Louise von Franz noted that those who appear perfectly adjusted often experience sudden episodes of irrational or self-destructive behavior. The mask eventually cracks, revealing the storm that has been gathering behind it. Jung also described what he called archetypal possession, one of the most extreme and dangerous psychological conditions. Archetypes are universal patterns that exist within the collective unconscious: the hero, the victim, the savior, the judge. These archetypes are not inherently bad, but when one of them takes full control of a person's consciousness, the individual identity disappears. They become a vessel for that archetype, speaking and acting not as themselves but as an idea. When this happens, the person's eyes may seem strangely intense, their speech rigid and absolute. They might see themselves as a divine messenger, a moral crusader, or a righteous victim. Jung noted that in such moments, you are no longer interacting with a complete human being, but with a fragment of the collective psyche that has taken control. This can be profoundly dangerous because the archetype carries both light and darkness. The savior contains compassion but also fanaticism. The judge contains fairness but also cruelty. When someone identifies entirely with one of these forces, they lose the ability to see their own contradictions. History is filled with examples of leaders and movements born from this kind of possession, fueled by absolute certainty and a sense of destiny. The final danger Jung described is the compulsion to repeat, a tragic pattern in which a person unconsciously recreates the same painful situations over and over again.
Typed on a paper bag, said, "Don't you come looking, baby." Sealed with her lips, said, "Thrive." This is red star, broke star, night train, stop, don't stop no more.
These individuals are not choosing their suffering consciously. They are driven by unconscious forces shaped by early trauma or unresolved experiences. They seem to attract the same type of conflict, betrayal, or failure no matter how much they try to change. Each time, they feel surprised, unaware that they are the architects of their own repetition. Modern neuroscience shows that early emotional experiences form neural pathways that shape how we interpret the world. Once these patterns are set, the brain unconsciously seeks to confirm them, even when they lead to pain. Jung called this process negative synchronicity, the mysterious way our inner conflicts draw us into outer circumstances that mirror them. Until we bring these unconscious patterns to light, we remain caught in cycles that feel like fate. As Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Despite these dangers, Jung also offered a path toward healing, the conscious integration of the shadow. To integrate the shadow is not to become perfect or pure, but to acknowledge one's full humanity, the capacity for both good and evil, wisdom and ignorance, love and fear. Jung once said, "I would rather be whole than good." He meant that real psychological health does not come from pretending to be virtuous, but from embracing the truth of what we are. This process is echoed in many spiritual traditions. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of transforming poison into medicine, using painful emotions as material for awareness. Western alchemy, which fascinated Jung, describes turning lead into gold, symbolizing the transformation of unconscious darkness into conscious understanding. When someone has genuinely begun this inner work, it shows. They no longer idealize themselves or condemn others with self-righteous certainty. Instead, they speak with honesty about their own flaws and compassion toward the flaws of others. Neuroscience has even found that this process of psychological integration creates new connections between the emotional and reflective parts of the brain, allowing people to respond with greater empathy and awareness. By recognizing our shadow rather than denying it, we free ourselves from its hidden control. The energy once spent on repression becomes available for creativity, love, and authentic living. Those who have integrated their shadow see life not in black and white, but in shades of grey. They understand that every person carries both light and darkness, and that wisdom lies not in denial, but in balance. True maturity begins when we abandon the fantasy of our own innocence. The wisest teachers throughout history, from the Dalai Lama to Teresa of Avila to Rumi, have spoken openly about their doubts, flaws, and inner contradictions. Their honesty is what makes them trustworthy. The most dangerous people are not those who admit their darkness, but those who are convinced they have none. Before exploring specific warning signs, we must understand the basic architecture of Jung's psychological model. Unlike the comparatively simple Freudian structure of id, ego, and superego, Jung proposed a more complex and nuanced understanding of the psyche. At the center of Jung's model sits the ego, the conscious aspect of personality, the I that we identify as ourselves. The ego is not the totality of the psyche, but merely the tip of an enormous iceberg. The small portion of our psychological being that exists in conscious awareness at any given moment. Beneath and surrounding the ego lies the personal unconscious, containing all the material that has been forgotten, repressed, or never reached consciousness. Memories, impulses, perceptions that our conscious mind filtered out or pushed away. This closely resembles Freud's conception of the unconscious. But Jung went further, proposing a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious. This transpersonal dimension contains what Jung termed archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that structure our perceptions, emotions, and behaviors. These are not learned, but inherited, the psychological equivalent of physical instincts. The archetypes include fundamental patterns like the mother, the father, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, and many others. They manifest through symbols, dreams, myths, and the organization of our lived experience. Two particular psychological structures within this model prove essential for understanding Jung's warning signs: the shadow and the persona. The shadow represents everything about ourselves that we cannot accept or acknowledge: traits, impulses, capacities that contradict our self-image. If we see ourselves as gentle, our capacity for aggression lives in the shadow. If we identify as rational, our irrationality is shadowed. If we consider ourselves good, our capacity for cruelty is rejected into shadow. The shadow is not inherently negative. It contains both problematic aspects we rightly suppress and positive potentials we wrongly deny. An overly submissive person shadows their healthy assertiveness. An intellectual may shadow their emotional and instinctual wisdom. The persona, conversely, represents our social mask, the constructed identity we present to the world. The term comes from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in classical theatre. We all need a persona. It allows us to function in society, fulfill roles, and maintain appropriate boundaries. Problems arise when we become completely identified with the persona, believing the mask to be our true self, or when the persona becomes so divorced from our inner reality that we live in a state of permanent self-betrayal. Psychological health, in Jung's view, requires maintaining a dynamic relationship between these structures. The ego must remain connected to the unconscious while not being overwhelmed by it. We must develop an adequate persona without becoming imprisoned within it. We must progressively integrate shadow material into conscious awareness without being flooded by it. Jung called this lifelong process individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness. The 5 warning signs we will explore represent different ways this essential balance can be catastrophically disrupted, creating individuals who have lost the capacity for genuine self-reflection and thus become dangerous to themselves and others. Warning sign 1. Shadow projection, the distorted mirror. Shadow projection stands as perhaps the most pervasive and insidious of Jung's warning signs. It occurs when we unconsciously attribute aspects of our own shadow, those parts of ourselves we cannot accept, to other people. In its mild forms, shadow projection is nearly universal and relatively harmless. The orderly person who finds spontaneity chaotic, the frugal individual who sees extravagance everywhere, the intellectual who dismisses emotion as weakness. These everyday projections can be corrected through self-reflection and feedback from others. However, Jung identified a far more dangerous manifestation: systematic, massive shadow projection, in which an individual habitually and intensely projects vast shadow content onto others, particularly onto specific individuals or groups. This represents not a minor perceptual distortion, but a fundamental break with reality. The mechanism operates as follows. When aspects of ourselves become completely unacceptable to our conscious ego identity, they are forcefully expelled from awareness and relegated to the shadow. However, these rejected aspects do not disappear. They accumulate psychic energy in the unconscious. Since we cannot see them in ourselves, they have been made literally invisible to our self-perception. We encounter them exclusively as qualities of other people. The more completely we reject something in ourselves, the more readily we will perceive it in others, often in exaggerated or distorted form. What makes this particularly dangerous is the absolute conviction that accompanies shadow projection. The person is not lying or deliberately misrepresenting reality. They genuinely perceive what they claim to see. From their subjective experience, you truly possess the negative qualities they attribute to you. This creates an impenetrable barrier to correction. When you deny possessing these qualities or point out the projection, the person interprets this denial as further evidence of your deception, defensiveness, or lack of self-awareness. Consider an example: a person who has completely disowned their own capacity for manipulation, perhaps because their self-image requires them to be purely authentic and direct, will begin seeing manipulation everywhere in others. A friend's kind gesture becomes suspected of hidden agendas. A colleague's professional success is reinterpreted as cunning social maneuvering. A partner's reasonable request is experienced as coercive manipulation. The shadow projector lives in a world populated by manipulators, never recognizing that the pattern they see repeatedly is actually a reflection of their own unacknowledged capacity. Jung observed that shadow projection often has a magnetic quality, drawing out the very behavior it suspects. If someone consistently treats you as manipulative, you may begin to calculate your words carefully to avoid triggering their suspicion, a guardedness they then interpret as proof of manipulation. This creates self-fulfilling prophecies that seem to validate the projection. Ancient wisdom traditions recognized this pattern long before Jung articulated it psychologically. In the Christian Gospels, Jesus asks, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" Matthew 7:3. This is not merely moral instruction, but psychological observation. Our most vehement judgments of others often reveal our own most energetically denied aspects. Buddhism speaks of the darkened mirror that reflects one's own impurities as if they belonged to others. Islamic mysticism describes the nafs, the ego self that constantly projects its own qualities onto the external world. The danger of being in close relationship with someone who engages in systematic shadow projection cannot be overstated. First, you become the container for their disowned psychological material, forced to carry aspects of their psyche that they refuse to acknowledge. This creates a distorted relational field where genuine contact becomes impossible. You are not meeting the other person, but rather their projected shadow. Second, chronic shadow projection can have a gaslighting effect. When someone consistently attributes to you motivations and intentions you do not possess, you may begin to doubt your own self-perception. This is especially true when the projector is convincing enough to recruit third parties to their distorted view, a phenomenon Jung noted was particularly common, as the projector's absolute conviction can be persuasive to others. Third, and most seriously, the person who systematically projects their shadow has lost access to a fundamental capacity for self-reflection. They cannot recognize their own denied aspects, which means these aspects will increasingly control their behavior from the unconscious. What we do not consciously acknowledge, we unconsciously enact. The warning signal appears when you notice a persistent disconnection between how someone perceives you and your actual internal experience. They accuse you of emotions you do not feel, attribute motivations you do not possess, and insist on their accuracy with an intensity disproportionate to the situation. More tellingly, their accusations often reveal more about their own psychology than yours. The person who constantly suspects others of jealousy may be wrestling with their own envy. The individual who sees everyone as selfish may be unable to acknowledge their own self-interest. The one who perceives victimhood everywhere may be fleeing their own aggressive impulses. Jung's clinical recommendation when encountering systematic shadow projection was clear. Establish distance, not because the person is morally bad or consciously malicious, but because they have lost the psychological flexibility necessary for genuine relationship. You cannot have authentic contact with someone who is fundamentally unable to see you as you are. Warning sign 2. Ego inflation, the dangerous certainty. If shadow projection represents the ego's inability to recognize its own darkness, ego inflation, or psychic inflation, as Jung sometimes called it, represents the opposite danger, the ego's identification with light. This phenomenon occurs when an individual's conscious ego merges with archetypal content, particularly with archetypal images of the divine, the savior, the enlightened being, or the bearer of absolute truth. Jung distinguished carefully between healthy engagement with archetypal energies and pathological inflation. In healthy psychological development, we may temporarily identify with archetypes as part of our growth. A young person may need to embody the hero archetype to separate from parents and establish independence. Someone in a helping profession may need to channel the healer archetype. These temporary identifications, when conscious and flexible, facilitate development. Inflation occurs when the ego claims permanent ownership of archetypal qualities, losing the awareness that these energies are transpersonal forces flowing through the individual, not qualities possessed by the individual. The person no longer says, "I am experiencing archetypal energies of the healer," but rather, "I am the healer." The distinction seems subtle, but represents a fundamental shift in psychological structure. What makes ego inflation particularly dangerous is that it disguises itself as virtue. Unlike obvious personality disorders characterized by aggressive or antisocial behavior, inflation often presents as spiritual advancement, moral superiority, or special knowledge. The inflated individual appears evolved, enlightened, or morally transcendent. They speak with authority about love, compassion, truth, or justice. They may gather followers who perceive their certainty as evidence of genuine wisdom. The primary warning sign of inflation is the complete absence of doubt. While every genuine spiritual teacher, philosopher, and psychological thinker throughout history has expressed humility before the mysteries of existence, acknowledging the limits of their understanding and the provisional nature of their insights, the inflated individual exhibits absolute certainty. They do not offer perspectives or share insights. They pronounce truths. They do not explore questions, they deliver answers. This certainty extends to moral judgment. The inflated person divides the world into clear categories: those who understand, who agree with them, and those who do not, those who serve the good, who follow them, and those who resist it, the enlightened and the ignorant. This binary worldview admits no genuine complexity or ambiguity. All opposition is interpreted not as legitimate disagreement, but as moral or spiritual failure. Jung observed that inflation creates extraordinary charisma precisely because of this quality of absolute conviction. Human beings facing an uncertain and ambiguous world find profound comfort in certainty. The inflated individual offers definitive answers to questions that thoughtful people recognize as complex. This can attract devoted followers who mistake inflation for authentic authority. The danger manifests in several ways. First, the inflated individual has lost access to self-correction. Since they have identified with the divine or absolute, questioning themselves would be equivalent to questioning ultimate reality. This creates a psychological closed system impervious to feedback, learning, or growth. Second, inflation inevitably contains its opposite. Jung's principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when pushed to an extreme, applies with particular force to inflation. The person who identifies most strongly with being a savior contains an equally strong but unconscious identification with being destructive. The one most inflated with spiritual purity holds the greatest shadow of spiritual corruption. These opposites exist in a state of dynamic tension, and the more extreme the inflation, the more violent the eventual eruption of its opposite. History provides tragic examples: spiritual teachers who preached love while abusing followers, political leaders who claimed to serve the people while perpetrating atrocities, religious figures convinced of their divine mandate who justified horrific acts. In each case, the inflation prevented them from recognizing the shadow aspects of their actions. They experienced themselves as channels of pure good even while enacting evil, a perceptual dissociation made possible only by extreme psychic inflation. Third, inflation places unbearable pressure on the psyche. Jung described the ego as a small vessel attempting to contain oceanic archetypal energies. When inflation occurs, this small vessel claims to be the ocean itself. The psychological tension this creates is enormous and unsustainable. Eventually, compensation must occur, either through a catastrophic deflation, depression, breakdown, or exposure, or through increasingly extreme behavior designed to maintain the inflated state. Ancient mystical traditions recognized this danger clearly. Christian mystics warned against spiritual pride as the most insidious obstacle to genuine development. Meister Eckhart spoke of needing to release even our attachment to God to truly find God. Zen Buddhism describes Zen sickness, the state where students mistake preliminary insights for complete enlightenment, becoming trapped in subtle ego inflation. Sufi teachers speak of the veil of light that is more dangerous than the veil of darkness, precisely because it is harder to recognize as an obstacle. The Chilean psychiatrist Claudio Naranjo articulated the distinction powerfully. An ordinary ego says, "I am important." An inflated spiritual ego says, "I am a vessel for the supreme good." This latter statement sounds humble, but actually represents a more refined and dangerous form of inflation. By claiming to be a mere channel, the person simultaneously elevates themselves above ordinary humanity and shields themselves from criticism, since any criticism can be reframed as resistance to the divine working through them. Recognizing inflation in another requires attention to subtle signals. Listen for the absence of phrases like "I think," "in my experience," "I may be wrong," "but," or "I'm still learning about." Notice whether the person can genuinely entertain perspectives different from their own, or if they immediately categorize all disagreement as ignorance or resistance. Observe their reaction to criticism. Do they examine it for possible truth, or do they experience it as an affront to cosmic order? Most tellingly, notice whether their certainty increases in direct proportion to the complexity of the question. Wise individuals become more cautious and nuanced when addressing complex issues. Inflated individuals become more absolute and certain. When someone exhibits complete confidence about matters that thoughtful people recognize as genuinely complicated, the nature of consciousness, the meaning of existence, the right way to live, you are likely witnessing inflation. Jung's recommendation regarding inflated individuals was to maintain appropriate boundaries and recognize that you are not dealing with a complete human personality, but with someone whose ego has merged with transpersonal content. The person themselves is in a state of psychological emergency, even if they appear elevated or spiritually advanced. They have, in Jung's words, abandoned the human condition by identifying with forces larger than any individual can safely contain. Warning sign 3. Complete persona identification, the perfect mask. While shadow projection and ego inflation represent failures to properly relate to unconscious content, complete identification with the persona represents a different but equally dangerous pattern. The sacrifice of authentic interior life for the sake of external presentation. This creates what Jung called living from the outside, a state where the person's entire psychological energy is invested in maintaining a socially acceptable image, while the inner world withers into neglect or rigidity. The persona itself is not problematic, it is psychologically necessary. We all require a functional social mask that allows us to fulfill various roles: professional, familial, social. A healthy persona is flexible, shifting appropriately between contexts while remaining connected to the authentic self beneath. Problems arise when the identification becomes complete, when the person forgets the mask is a mask and believes the constructed image to be their entire identity. Jung used the Greek theatrical term persona deliberately. In classical theatre, actors wore masks that represented stock characters. The audience understood these masks as representations, not as the actor's true face. Similarly, our social personas should be understood as functional constructions that facilitate social interaction, not as our complete reality. The danger emerges when we lose this distinction. Complete persona identification manifests as an eerie perfection in social presentation. The person always knows what to say, how to behave, what emotional expressions to display. Their responses are technically impeccable, but lack the spontaneity, inconsistency, and occasional awkwardness that characterize authentic human interaction. There is a scripted quality to their behavior, as though they are performing rather than being. The Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa captured this phenomenon brilliantly. The danger is not in the mask, but in forgetting it is a mask. When we forget the authentic self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, begins to atrophy. Psychological energy that should be circulating between conscious and unconscious, between outer and inner, becomes frozen in maintaining the external image. Eastern contemplative traditions recognize this pattern centuries before Jung. Zen Buddhism speaks of the original face before your parents were born, that essential authenticity existing prior to all social conditioning. Taoist masters warned that excessive polishing of the surface causes the substance to wear away. Hindu philosophy differentiates between the true self, Atman, and the social self, Ahamkara, warning against confusing the two. The warning signals appear as subtle incongruencies that our nervous system detects before our conscious mind can articulate them. Neuroscientists have discovered that we possess mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that simulate the internal states of people we observe. When someone's external presentation is completely disconnected from their internal reality, our mirror neurons receive conflicting signals. The words say one thing, the micro-expressions another, the body language something else entirely. This creates an inexplicable feeling of discomfort or distrust, a sense that something is off despite technically correct behavior. This is the source of that peculiar unease we sometimes feel around people who seem too good to be true. People whose behavior is impeccable, but somehow doesn't feel authentic. Our unconscious has detected the dissociation between persona and inner reality, even if we cannot consciously articulate what we're sensing. The danger of complete persona identification extends in two directions. For the person themselves, it represents what Jung called a betrayal of the self, an abandonment of authentic individuality in favor of collective expectations. The pressure of maintaining a perfect external image while suppressing all aspects that don't fit this image creates enormous internal tension. The psyche does not tolerate permanent dissociation. Compensation must eventually occur. This compensation often manifests as what Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's close collaborator, called shadow eruptions, moments when the rigidly controlled persona suddenly fractures and all the repressed material explodes into consciousness. These eruptions can range from minor inconsistencies, the perfectly controlled person has an inexplicable outburst, to major breakdowns or destructive acts that seem completely out of character. This explains a phenomenon that baffles observers. Why do apparently perfect people sometimes commit shocking acts? The politician known for family values caught in sordid scandals. The spiritual teacher preaching enlightenment who abuses students. The upstanding citizen who suddenly commits violence. In each case, the more rigid and perfect the persona, the more chaotic and potentially destructive the shadow content accumulating behind it. For those in relationship with someone completely identified with their persona, the danger lies in the unreality of the connection. You cannot have genuine intimacy with a mask. Every interaction remains at the surface level, technically correct, but fundamentally hollow. There is no real meeting between two authentic individuals, only a performance you are witnessing and perhaps unconsciously expected to validate. Moreover, living with someone in this state of dissociation can create a strange psychological burden. You may find yourself unconsciously carrying the emotional content they cannot acknowledge, feeling the anger, sadness, or messiness they refuse to permit in themselves. This can create confusion about whose feelings are whose, as you become the receptacle for their disowned emotional life. Jung noted that extreme persona identification often correlates with rigid early environments where the child learned that authentic self-expression was dangerous or unacceptable. The persona that forms under these conditions is not a flexible tool, but a suit of armor, rigid, heavy, and increasingly difficult to remove. The person has learned that survival depends on perfect external adaptation, and they continue this pattern long after the original danger has passed. Recognition requires attention to patterns rather than individual moments. Does the person ever reveal vulnerability, uncertainty, or imperfection? Do they have moments where the mask slips and you glimpse the human being underneath? Or is there a relentless consistency to their presentation that feels more manufactured than authentic? Can they laugh at themselves, acknowledge mistakes, or reveal aspects that don't fit their polished image? Or do they maintain a hermetic seal between their external presentation and any possible contradiction? The absence of healthy inconsistency, of those small awkwardnesses, contradictions, and imperfections that characterize authentic humanity, serves as the primary warning sign. Perfect adaptation, paradoxically, signals profound dysfunction. Warning sign 4. Archetypal possession, the loss of individual identity. While ego inflation involves the ego claiming archetypal qualities as personal possessions, archetypal possession represents a more severe phenomenon. The ego is overwhelmed and subsumed by archetypal energies, effectively disappearing as an independent center of consciousness. The person becomes a vehicle for transpersonal forces that exceed their capacity for integration or control. Understanding this requires grasping Jung's concept of archetypes more fully. Archetypes are not specific images, but rather structuring principles of human experience, primordial patterns that organize our perceptions, emotions, and behaviors. They exist in the collective unconscious as potentials that become activated by life circumstances. When activated, they can be extraordinarily powerful, channeling psychic energy that far exceeds ordinary ego consciousness. In healthy psychological functioning, we can access archetypal energies while maintaining ego consciousness. A mother caring for a sick child may access energies of the archetypal mother, extraordinary patience, intuitive knowing, fierce protectiveness, while still remaining herself, aware that these energies flow through her but are not exclusively her. An artist creating may channel the archetypal creator, accessing inspiration beyond ordinary consciousness, while maintaining enough ego presence to shape the material. Possession occurs when this balance collapses. The ego is no longer accessing archetypal energy, it has been replaced by it. The person's individual personality temporarily disappears, subsumed into a transpersonal pattern. They are no longer channeling the archetype, they have become it. This manifests as a disturbing change in presence. The person physically remains the same, but something fundamental shifts. Their eyes may take on a different quality, a certain fixedness or intensity that seems to look through rather than at you. Their voice may change in tone or rhythm. Most unsettlingly, you have the distinct sense that you are no longer relating to a complete human personality, but to a fragment, a single note played at overwhelming volume rather than the complex chord of an integrated human being. Traditional cultures recognized and addressed this phenomenon through sophisticated systems of ritual and containment. Shamanic traditions worldwide differentiate between controlled invocation of spiritual forces and dangerous possession states where individual identity is lost. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade documented how shamans underwent rigorous training, specifically to learn how to open themselves to transpersonal energies, while maintaining enough ego integrity to avoid being overwhelmed. The shaman accesses archetypal forces intentionally within ritual containers and returns to ordinary consciousness afterwards. Western religious traditions developed similar frameworks. Christian mysticism emphasized discernment of spirits, the ability to distinguish beneficial spiritual influences from potentially destructive ones. The assumption was that various forces could influence consciousness, and wisdom required learning to navigate these forces with discernment rather than simply opening oneself to whatever arrives. Modern psychology, particularly in its early days, dismissed these traditional understandings as superstition. Jung was one of the few to recognize that these ancient systems addressed genuine psychological phenomena. What traditional cultures called possession, Jung understood as the ego's submersion in archetypal content. The specific archetype involved matters less than the totality of the identification. A person may be possessed by the savior archetype, becoming absolutely convinced they are destined to rescue humanity. Another might be consumed by the victim archetype, experiencing all events through the lens of perpetual persecution. Someone else might embody the warrior, unable to relate to life except through conflict and conquest, or the judge, compulsively categorizing and condemning. The warning signs include several observable changes. First, psychological flexibility disappears. The possessed individual cannot shift perspective or access different aspects of themselves. They are monotone in their presence. The same quality pervades everything they say and do. Second, there is often a quality of impersonality. You sense you are not relating to a unique individual, but to something more generic, as though this person could be interchangeable with anyone else possessed by the same archetype. Third, and most characteristic, the person exhibits extraordinary certainty and sense of purpose. The ambiguity of ordinary consciousness, the constant negotiation between competing values, the uncertainty about one's motivations and choices, disappears. In its place emerges absolute conviction. The person knows exactly what they must do, what is true, what is required. This certainty can be extremely persuasive because it touches something in observers that longs for such clarity in an ambiguous world. Modern neuroscience has identified brain states that correlate with what Jung described as archetypal possession. Neuroimaging studies show that certain mystical or transpersonal experiences involve decreased activity in brain regions associated with sense of personal identity, particularly the default mode network and areas of the prefrontal cortex related to self-referential processing, combined with increased activity in areas associated with emotional intensity and meaning-making. While such states can be valuable in appropriate contexts, meditation, ritual, therapy, they become dangerous when they occur spontaneously, without containment, and without the person having resources to integrate them. What makes archetypal possession particularly dangerous is that archetypes are inherently bipolar. They contain extreme opposites held in tension. The savior archetype includes both redemptive compassion and destructive fanaticism. The mother includes both nurturing care and devouring possessiveness. The warrior contains both courageous protection and mindless aggression. When someone is possessed by an archetype, they inevitably enact both poles, often without any awareness of the contradiction. Jung documented numerous cases where individuals possessed by positive archetypes committed destructive acts while experiencing themselves as serving the good. The person possessed by the healer may cause harm through intrusive boundary violations, all while convinced they are helping. The one possessed by the teacher may become authoritarian and abusive, certain they are serving their students' highest good. The one possessed by the lover may become obsessive and destructive, experiencing their stalking as devotion. Most alarmingly, archetypal possession can create partial amnesia or extreme rationalization regarding contradictory behaviors. The person literally cannot see or remember actions that contradict the archetypal pattern. Their consciousness is structured by the archetype, which filters perception to confirm its own narrative. Evidence of destructive behavior is either forgotten, minimized, or reinterpreted to fit the archetypal story. For those encountering someone in a state of archetypal possession, Jung's guidance was clear. Recognize that you are not dealing with a fully conscious human being. The person is in a genuine psychological emergency, even if they appear certain and purposeful. They have temporarily lost the self-reflective capacity that allows us to observe our own process, question our motivations, and adjust our behavior. In this state, they are capable of actions completely contrary to their actual values, actions they may later not fully remember or will rationalize extensively. The appropriate response is to establish clear boundaries while avoiding direct confrontation, which typically only intensifies the possession. You cannot reason someone out of archetypal possession, because reason requires a functioning ego that can step back from immediate experience. The possessed individual has no such distance. They are inside the archetypal experience completely. Warning, Sign 5, Compulsion to Repeat, the Invisible Prison. The final warning sign Jung identified represents perhaps the saddest of all psychological patterns, the compulsion to repeat unresolved trauma. Unlike the previous patterns, which involve problematic relationships between consciousness and unconscious content, the compulsion to repeat represents the unconscious attempt to heal wounds that consciousness cannot access or address. Jung observed that patients consistently recreated similar painful situations with different people, as though following an invisible script they could not see. A woman who experienced betrayal by a parent would unconsciously seek out partners who would betray her. A man who felt abandoned in childhood would structure relationships to guarantee abandonment. A person raised in chaos would generate chaos in otherwise stable circumstances. Each time the pattern repeated, the person seemed genuinely surprised, as though they were a victim of cruel fate rather than an unconscious architect of their own recurring experience. What makes this pattern particularly tragic is its motivation. The unconscious is attempting to master an experience it could not integrate when it originally occurred. By recreating similar circumstances, the psyche hopes to achieve a different outcome, to finally process what remained unprocessed. It is as though the unconscious believes, this time will be different, this time I will heal the wound. But because the process remains entirely unconscious, the outcome typically reinforces rather than heals the original trauma. Modern psychoanalytic theory, building on Jung's insights, has extensively documented this phenomenon. Contemporary trauma research reveals that early experiences, especially traumatic ones, literally create neural pathways that become routes of least resistance for processing subsequent information. The brain develops neurological expectations that unconsciously seek to confirm pre-existing models of reality, even when these models produce suffering. Bessel van der Kolk, a leading trauma researcher, describes how the body keeps the score. Traumatic experiences become encoded not just as memories but as somatic patterns, emotional reflexes, and behavioral scripts. These patterns operate below conscious awareness, organizing experience according to past trauma rather than present reality. The compulsion to repeat typically originates in what psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas called unthought knowns, experiences that occurred before we had cognitive capacity to process them, or experiences so overwhelming that they bypassed normal memory processing. These experiences were never consciously known in a way that would allow cognitive integration, yet they profoundly organize all subsequent experience. Buddhist philosophy addresses this phenomenon through the concept of karma, originally understood not as a cosmic reward-punishment system, but precisely as these patterns of psychological conditioning that lead us to recreate similar circumstances repeatedly. Sanskrit texts describe samskaras, deep grooves of conditioning worn into consciousness that channel experience along predetermined paths. Western psychology arrived at similar insights through completely different routes. The warning signal appears when you observe someone who consistently ends up in remarkably similar painful situations, despite apparently different circumstances and participants. More specifically, pay attention when you notice pattern blindness. The person cannot see the pattern even when it is obvious to observers. They experience each repetition as entirely new and different. External attribution. They consistently attribute the pattern to external circumstances, bad luck, others' flaws, cosmic injustice, never recognizing their own unconscious role in recreating the situation. Dramatic recruitment. They unconsciously but actively recruit others to play specific roles in their unresolved drama. You may find yourself behaving in uncharacteristic ways or cast in a role that doesn't fit your actual personality. Intensity disproportionate to present circumstances. Their emotional reactions seem excessive or inappropriate to the current situation because they are responding to both present events and all the unintegrated past trauma that this situation unconsciously represents. Scripted quality. There is something predetermined about how situations unfold, as though following a hidden script. You can almost predict what will happen next because the pattern is so rigid. The danger of being in close relationship with someone trapped in unconscious repetition compulsions is that you may be recruited to play a role in their internal drama. As psychoanalyst Donald Culshard observed, unprocessed trauma demands to be enacted. The person cannot help but try to externalize their internal situation, unconsciously manipulating circumstances to recreate the familiar pattern. You might find yourself cast as the abandoner, the persecutor, the betrayer, or the savior in a drama that began long before you met this person. The role doesn't fit you, it belongs to someone from their past. But the unconscious pressure to fulfill this role can be enormous. The person may unconsciously provoke you to behave in ways that confirm their expectation, creating self-fulfilling prophecies that seem to validate their internal model. What makes this particularly disturbing is that the person trapped in repetition compulsion often exhibits a kind of negative synchronicity, an uncanny ability to find themselves in situations that perfectly recreate their original trauma. Jung noticed that compulsion to repeat often manifests through apparently coincidental events that seem imposed by fate. The person who fears abandonment happens to choose partners who are emotionally unavailable. The one who experienced betrayal coincidentally encounters people who betray them. The pattern appears external, but is actually being unconsciously orchestrated from within. Marie-Louise von Franz expressed this phenomenon powerfully. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This captures the essence of repetition compulsion. What feels like terrible luck or external persecution is actually the unconscious organizing experience according to its unhealed wounds. Breaking free from repetition compulsion requires bringing the unconscious pattern into conscious awareness, a process that often requires therapeutic support. The pattern must be seen, named, and grieved before new possibilities can emerge. But the person trapped in the pattern, by definition, cannot see it. Their consciousness is structured to filter out awareness of the pattern, focusing instead on external details that seem to make each repetition unique. For those encountering someone in the grip of repetition compulsion, the wise response is to avoid being recruited into their drama. This requires recognizing when you are being pressured to play a role that doesn't fit you, when situations have a scripted quality, when your instincts tell you something is off, even if you can't articulate what. It means maintaining clear boundaries and refusing to participate in dynamics that feel predetermined. It also requires compassion. The person repeating their trauma is not doing so from malice, but from a deep unconscious drive to heal. They are trying to solve something that cannot be solved through repetition, but only through conscious integration. They are, in a profound sense, stuck in a tragic loop, unable to move forward because they cannot see the pattern they are trapped within. The path forward, shadow integration and psychological wholeness. Having explored 5 warning signs of psychological danger, we must ask, what distinguishes psychologically dangerous individuals from those pursuing authentic development? The answer, for Jung, lies in the conscious integration of shadow content, the willingness to recognize, own and work with the aspects of ourselves we would prefer to deny. Shadow integration represents the fundamental difference between psychological health and pathology. It is not the absence of negative qualities that makes someone psychologically mature. All humans contain the full spectrum of potential, capacity for cruelty and kindness, wisdom and foolishness, creation and destruction. The difference lies in relationship to this material. Do we consciously acknowledge our darker capacities? Or do we defensively deny them, ensuring they will control us from the unconscious? Jung's famous statement, "I would rather be whole than good," is often misunderstood as advocating immorality. Actually, it points to the difference between authentic integrity and a constructed facade of perfection. Wholeness means acknowledging all aspects of our psyche, including those we find uncomfortable or shameful. This honest recognition dramatically decreases the likelihood of unconsciously acting out these aspects. Conversely, maintained innocence, the insistence that we are purely good, inevitably leads to shadow eruptions, where our denied aspects explode into consciousness and action. What does shadow integration look like in practice? It manifests as a distinctive combination of self-honesty and compassion toward others. The person engaged in this process can acknowledge their own problematic impulses without drowning in shame. They can say, "Yes, I feel envy," or "Yes, I have aggressive fantasies," or "Yes, I am capable of manipulation," treating these as aspects of human complexity requiring conscious management rather than shameful secrets requiring denial. This radical honesty extends to how they perceive others. Someone who has recognized their own capacity for selfishness, anger, or pettiness cannot self-righteously condemn these qualities in others. They can set boundaries and make clear assessments about behavior without the moral inflation that comes from projecting one's own shadow. They see human complexity in shades of grey rather than simplistic black and white. Ancient contemplative traditions articulated this process using different languages but pointing to the same essential work. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of transforming poison into medicine, recognizing that even difficult emotions and tendencies can be worked with constructively rather than suppressed. Western alchemical traditions, which fascinated Jung deeply, symbolically depicted this as the transmutation of lead, rejected material, into gold, integrated consciousness. Sufi mysticism describes polishing the mirror of the heart to reflect reality clearly, removing the distortions created by ego defenses. Contemporary neuroscience confirms that shadow integration has observable neurological correlates. Researchers like Daniel Siegel have documented how bringing previously dissociated material into conscious awareness literally creates new neural connections, particularly between primitive emotional centers and prefrontal areas associated with self-reflection and emotional regulation. Integration isn't just metaphorical, it represents actual structural changes in brain functioning. The indicators of genuine shadow work are unmistakable. The person demonstrates psychological flexibility, able to shift perspectives and acknowledge multiple dimensions of situations. They can laugh at themselves, recognizing their own contradictions and absurdities without harsh self-condemnation. They exhibit genuine humility, not false modesty, but an accurate assessment of their capacities and limitations. They can receive criticism non-defensively, examining it for potential truth rather than immediately rejecting it. Most tellingly, they show compassion precisely where they have done their own work. Someone who has struggled with and integrated their own anger can hold space for others' anger without being threatened by it. Someone who has acknowledged their own insecurity can recognize it in others with empathy rather than contempt. Having descended into their own darkness and returned, they can accompany others in theirs. Jung noted that this process of integration is never complete. It represents lifelong work rather than a final achievement. New shadow material continues to emerge as we develop and face new life circumstances. The goal is not perfection, but increasing consciousness, progressively expanding the circle of what we can acknowledge and integrate. The great spiritual exemplars throughout history have embodied this integrated awareness. The Dalai Lama speaks openly about his moments of anger and frustration. Christian mystics like Teresa of Avila wrote honestly about periods of spiritual dryness and doubt. The Sufi poet Rumi crafted verses celebrating his internal contradictions. This radical honesty, acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience within themselves, stands in stark contrast to the artificial perfection of those dissociated from their shadow. For those of us navigating human relationships, the ability to recognize shadow integration in others provides crucial guidance. When someone can acknowledge their own difficult aspects without shame or inflation, when they respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, when they exhibit compassion toward human complexity rather than harsh judgment, these signals indicate psychological health and relational safety. Conversely, extreme claims of personal virtue, inability to acknowledge flaws, harsh judgment of others' failings, and defensive reactions to feedback all suggest unintegrated shadow material that may eventually erupt destructively. Practical applications: navigating human relationships. Understanding Jung's warning signs provides a practical framework for navigating relationships while pursuing our own psychological development. How do we apply these insights without becoming paranoid or judgmental? First, recognize that we all exhibit these patterns to some degree. Shadow projection, persona identification, and repetition compulsion are part of normal human psychology. The question is not whether these patterns exist, but rather their rigidity, intensity, and the person's capacity for self-reflection about them. Mild projection that can be corrected through feedback differs vastly from systematic projection, impervious to contrary evidence. Second, use these concepts primarily for self-examination rather than diagnosis of others. The person best positioned to work with your shadow is you. When you find yourself harshly judging someone, pause to ask, might this reflect something I'm rejecting in myself? When you feel inflated with certainty, consider, have I lost access to doubt and complexity? When patterns keep repeating in your life, investigate: what unresolved material might I be unconsciously recreating? Third, trust your instinctive responses while also examining them. That inexplicable discomfort you feel around someone may be detecting genuine psychological danger, or it may reflect your own projections and biases. Hold both possibilities. Notice the feeling, take it seriously as information, but also investigate it honestly. Fourth, recognize that establishing boundaries with psychologically dangerous individuals is not punishment but necessity. Just as you wouldn't judge someone for stepping away from a physical danger, don't judge yourself for creating distance from psychological danger. The person projecting massively onto you, possessed by archetypal energies, or completely identified with a rigid persona, is not available for authentic relationship, regardless of your efforts. Fifth, approach others with what Jung called the wounded healer consciousness. Recognizing that psychological wounds are universal, that each person carries their burden of unintegrated material, and that judgment helps no one while compassionate boundaries serve everyone. Finally, commit to your own integration work. This might involve therapy, particularly depth-oriented approaches like Jungian analysis that explicitly work with shadow material. It might involve contemplative practices that develop self-observation. It might involve creative work, writing, art, music, that gives form to unconscious content. The specific method matters less than genuine engagement with the full spectrum of your psychological reality. Conclusion: the journey toward wholeness. Carl Jung's identification of psychological warning signs provides invaluable guidance for navigating human relationships and pursuing our own development, yet the ultimate purpose of this knowledge is not to label others as dangerous, but to recognize the universal human task, the integration of consciousness with the unconscious, the reconciliation of persona with shadow, the development of psychological wholeness Jung called individuation. Each warning sign, shadow projection, ego inflation, persona identification, archetypal possession, and compulsion to repeat represents a different way this essential integration can be disrupted. Together, they describe not discrete categories of people, but patterns all humans are susceptible to when we lose connection between conscious awareness and unconscious content. The path forward lies not in eliminating these patterns, which is impossible, but in bringing them into conscious awareness, where they can be worked with rather than acted out. This requires courage, for acknowledging our own capacity for projection, inflation, dissociation, possession, and repetition means relinquishing cherished self-images. It requires humility, for recognizing our psychological complexity means abandoning simplistic narratives of innocence or superiority. Most of all, it requires sustained commitment to the work of self-examination. Jung described individuation as the central task of the second half of life, but it is work that can begin at any moment for anyone willing to honestly encounter their complete psychological reality. The gift of this work extends beyond personal benefit. When we integrate our shadows, we stop projecting them onto others, reducing conflict and increasing genuine understanding. When we maintain appropriate relationship to archetypal energies without inflation or possession, we can access their power without being overwhelmed. When we recognize our compulsions to repeat, we can make new choices rather than recreating old wounds. Perhaps most importantly, the work of shadow integration cultivates genuine compassion. Having descended into our own darkness and returned, we can recognize similar struggles in others without judgment. Having acknowledged our own capacity for all that is human, both beautiful and terrible, we can hold space for others' complexity. Jung's warning signs ultimately are not meant to create fear but awareness. They illuminate patterns so we can recognize them in ourselves and others, not to condemn but to understand, not to judge but to navigate wisely. They remind us that psychological danger often wears the mask of certainty, perfection, or righteousness, while psychological health acknowledges complexity, embraces contradiction, and remains open to the messy, ambiguous, beautifully complicated reality of being human. In a world that increasingly demands simple answers, absolute certainty, and perfect presentation, Jung's insights offer something different. An invitation to wholeness that includes rather than excludes, that integrates rather than dissociates, that recognizes our shared humanity in all its light and shadow. This is not the easy path, but it is the one that leads toward genuine psychological health for ourselves and for those we encounter on the journey.